They thought fire was the only way to survive the cold. They were wrong. When coal vanished, when chimneys crumbled, when even kindling drew suspicion, civilians turned to heat without flame. They warmed homes with nothing but stone, ash, and silence. Soldiers marched with blankets and brass stoves. But families behind enemy lines, they used tricks the manuals never mention, because they weren't following protocol. They were following survival. No smoke, no smell, no signal. These weren't heating systems, they were defense mechanisms, engineered in cellars, barns, and buried shelters. Heat that couldn't be seen, warmth that wouldn't give them away. And the shocking part? Most of them still work, long after the war ended. These are 6 heating tricks from WWII, even soldiers never used. Number 1. Heated stone chambers. In Eastern Europe, when fuel disappeared and homes were shelled to ruin, heat wasn't just scarce, it was a liability. Smoke gave away position, light attracted attention, fire meant risk. And so, civilians found a solution older than the war itself. Stone-heated earth chambers, buried deep, warmed slow, and never visible from above. These chambers weren't new. The concept had existed for centuries, but under German occupation and Soviet advance, they were reborn as lifelines. Families dug below barns, behind homes, or under collapsed sheds. Chambers no taller than a crouching man, lined with dry stones, clay, or brick scraps. The trick wasn't the fire. It was how long the heat could last after the fire went out. At night, a small fire, barely more than a flame, was lit inside the chamber's fire pit, often using dried dung, crushed corn cobs, or sawdust cakes. The walls, packed tight with stone, absorbed the heat slowly. After just a few hours, the fire was extinguished, the embers covered, the chamber sealed. By morning, the walls radiated low, consistent warmth, enough to keep a family from freezing, dry out wet clothes, or keep food from spoiling. And because the heat came from thermal mass, not flame, there was no smoke, no glow, no sound. In parts of Poland and Belarus, entire families slept shoulder to shoulder inside these chambers, blankets draped over poles to trap warmth. Some chambers had raised sleeping platforms layered with straw and cloth. Others had simple shelves where infants could be kept above ground chill. Outside, it looked like ruin. Inside, it was survival. In Latvia, a common method involved lining the chamber with heated field stones and using iron stove plates, salvaged from broken homes, on top to radiate heat longer. In colder zones, small animal stalls were sometimes built above the chamber to trap body heat from goats or rabbits. This wasn't comfort, this was function. And it worked, but the system had limits. It wasn't fast. Heating took hours. Overheating was a threat. Without airflow, temperatures could rise dangerously. Smoke, if not managed well, could build up inside and suffocate. And if discovered, a chamber meant the family had shelter, something soldiers often seized. Still, it was quiet, it was reusable, and it used almost no fuel at all. This wasn't a stove, it wasn't a bunker. It was memory shaped into stone, warmed by ash, and sealed in silence. Could you build something? Number 2. Clay pot radiators. When wood ran out and coal was too loud to burn, families turned to the oldest material in their reach, clay. Not to cook, to heat. In bombed-out homes from Prague to Sarajevo, civilians used inverted clay pots to build silent, smokeless heat traps that worked long after the flame had died. The method was simple, but the effect, remarkable. They took unglazed clay flower pots, the kind used in rooftop gardens or courtyard herbs. Using salvaged bricks or iron rods, they suspended one pot inside another, open sides facing down. Beneath this dome, a small candle or oil flame was placed inside a tin can or metal bowl. As the flame burned, the air between the pots warmed. The clay absorbed that heat slowly, then radiated it outward in every direction. The outer surface stayed warm to the touch for hours, enough to heat a closed room, enough to stave off hypothermia. This wasn't central heating, but it kept fingers from freezing. It thawed bread. It warmed wet boots. Most importantly, it made no sound, no smoke, no scent. In occupied zones, that meant everything. In southern France, where curfews were brutal and wood was rationed, families lined bedrooms with 4 or 5 such setups, placed near walls, surrounded by bricks for insulation. The warmth wasn't instant. It built slowly, but it stayed longer than any candle alone could manage. Some used whale oil from old lamps. Others melted bacon fat into wicks. Even shoe polish was burned in desperation. Anything flammable became fuel. The key was containment. Flames were hidden. Light was blocked. Heat was trapped, amplified, and dispersed silently. In parts of Yugoslavia, this technique was used inside root cellars, especially to protect children and the elderly. Often, tin reflectors were added behind the clay pots to bounce more warmth outward. In certain regions, 3 or 4 units were positioned near bedding, layered beneath blankets and animal skins to form low heated shelters. Were dangers. Knock one over and fire spread fast. Overheat the pots and they cracked. Burn dirty fuel and lungs paid the price. But for most, these weren't deterrents. They were reality. Families adjusted. They kept sand nearby to smother accidents. They used broken tiles beneath the pots to catch leaks. Safety was a calculation, not a guarantee. And when done right, a single flame beneath layered clay could warm a room for nearly 6 hours, on nothing more than wax or fat. This wasn't invention. Number 3, brick bed heating. In homes without insulation, without stoves, and without electricity, the bed was no longer a place of comfort. It became a battleground against frost. So families turned to one of the simplest, most underestimated tools of the entire war: bricks. Not to build walls, to build heat. It started with one principle: thermal mass. Bricks, when heated, hold warmth for hours, even without constant fire, even when the house around them freezes. In Norway, Finland, and Eastern Germany, families collected bricks. Some scavenged from bombed buildings, others traded from construction sites. They were heated in fireplaces during the daytime or over outdoor pits while daylight allowed. Once hot to the touch, but not glowing, they were carefully wrapped in wool, linen, or old coats and tucked under bedding. The warmth released slowly, penetrating fabric and warming the sleeping space without the need for constant fuel. Some families built wooden boxes or crates filled with hay or straw to serve as insulation chambers. Heated bricks were placed inside. Then the whole unit was slid beneath the bed or beside it. This method kept backs warm, fingers flexible, and lungs from freezing in the night air. It was simple, but it worked. In bombed-out neighborhoods of Berlin, families too scared to light fires after dark used this trick every night. They'd heat a dozen bricks in a shared courtyard stove, wrap them in newspaper, and place them between sleeping children. The bricks cooled by morning, but gave just enough warmth to help the body survive the deepest cold. In northern Italy, where nights dipped below freezing, entire mattresses were layered over brick platforms, not modern beds. Platforms built from stone and clay, preheated during the day and covered with animal hides or straw-filled pads. The heat rose upward through the night, slowly escaping, but never fast enough to vanish. And in rural Ukraine, some families went even further. They built sleeping stoves, wide brick stoves that doubled as beds. The fire was lit once per day, the bricks retained the heat, and the entire family would sleep atop the platform, layered in cloth and wool. These stoves were dangerous if mismanaged, but life-saving if done right. There were downsides. Bricks cracked under rapid heating. Mishandled units caused burns. Overheating could spark bedding fires, and the brick supply wasn't infinite. Many had to be reused constantly, wearing them thin over time. But compared to open flames, this system was safer. Compared to cold beds, it was survival. Families developed techniques to improve the system. Some used metal bed frames and attached brick trays underneath. Others embedded copper wires into the brick stacks, salvaged from electrical, just to help direct heat. Many used ash or sand-filled trays to slow cooling even further. Nothing about this method required money, just time. Number 4, or layered straw insulation. When glass shattered and walls collapsed, insulation vanished. Cold didn't knock, it entered. And when it stayed, families found a way to fight it, with something older than war, older than fire, straw. Not thrown in piles, not scattered, layered, structured, intentional. In rural Hungary, across the Ukrainian plains, and in the alpine valleys of Slovenia, straw wasn't bedding, it was survival architecture. After the harvest season, families preserved dry wheat straw in bundles, not for animals, for walls. They created double layers of interior straw walls, either by stacking it loose between fabric or packing it inside hollow wooden frames. In some homes, tarps or stitched linen sacks were nailed to the inside of broken walls, then filled with compressed straw like a giant quilt. Every inch counted. Every layer slowed the wind. Heat couldn't build without insulation, and straw gave them that buffer. In northern Romania, even roofs were retrofitted. Families removed ceiling panels and stuffed straw between beams. The upper layers of homes became thatched from within, holding body heat below like an invisible blanket. Inside, clothing lines were strung low across rooms, hung with blankets, rugs, and grain sacks. These weren't drying lines. They were indoor barriers, curtains to trap warmth inside a single room and block cold drafts from others. The effect was small, but in temperatures below zero, small differences were life-changing. In bombed parts of the Netherlands, straw wasn't just in walls, it was beneath floors. Families lifted old wooden planks and packed straw into the crawl space, creating a warmer base for sleeping mats. Even hay that was past its prime, starting to crumble, was still used. Dryness mattered more than strength. Straw's secret wasn't heat, it was resistant. It didn't create warmth. It refused to let it escape. It's light, accessible, and for families with no nails, no plastic, no fabric, straw was everywhere. But it wasn't perfect. Mold followed moisture, rodents followed crumbs, and if straw was packed too close to heat sources, it caught fire fast. So families learned the balance. They layered with space, kept fires low and distant, used vinegar-soaked cloths to line critical gaps, adding mold resistance and pest deterrent. This wasn't comfort. This wasn't modern insulation, but it was warmth, and that made it priceless. When supply chains failed, when firewood vanished, when walls turned to rubble, straw was turned into armor. Not against bullets, against cold. Today we call it primitive. Back then, it was brilliant. Layer by layer, bundle by bundle, they built warmth out of waste. Could your walls hold back winter without foam, fiberglass, or power? They did it in silence, in layers. Number 5, ash-insulated cooking pits. When fuel was scarce and warmth came at a price, even cooking had to become strategic. Fire was too valuable to waste. Smoke was too risky to release. So in the mountains of Austria and deep forests of Lithuania, families returned to a method their great-grandparents once used: ash-insulated pits. This wasn't open-fire cooking. It was retained heat cooking, engineered for warmth, stealth, and preservation. The method began with a shallow pit dug into the ground, just large enough to hold a small clay pot. The surrounding walls were lined with layers of cold, dry ash, left over from days of burned firewood. Ash wasn't discarded. It was stockpiled and stored in sacks. Not for waste, for insulation. Inside the pit, the cooking vessel was placed, typically filled with grains, beans, or boiled roots. A small fire, built separately using sticks or twigs, would be used to bring the contents of the pot to a boil. Then, quickly and without delay, the pot was removed from the flame and buried inside the ash-lined pit. The surrounding ash held the heat in place, slowing the loss of temperature and extending the cooking process for hours without a constant flame. And the best part, while the food cooked, the pit gave off warmth. Families sat near it with hands wrapped in cloth, drawing low-level heat through the earth. It didn't fill the house with heat, but it warmed fingers, dried socks, kept frostbite at bay. In rural Serbia, some families built these pits directly into the corners of their shelters, half dug into the floor, hidden beneath wooden planks. A small lid or rug would trap the heat, making it function like a miniature floor heater, while food cooked invisibly beneath. Ash was the key. It absorbed moisture. It blocked oxygen. It insulated like no fabric could. But the risks were clear. Ash with live embers sparked fire. Damp ash turned to sludge and bred mold. And if the pit wasn't cleared regularly, rodents found their way in. Still, the results couldn't be ignored. Hot meals, low fuel, silent heat. This wasn't a stove, it wasn't a fire, it was forgotten engineering, where food, heat, and silence came from the same pit. Can your kitchen do that without making a sound? They built theirs with ash, patience, and no second chances. Number 6, heated water bottle layers. When fuel vanished and fire was rationed to drops, families had to find a way to heat their bodies, not their rooms. In occupied Denmark, The bombed streets of Rotterdam and the snow-swept plains of northern Ukraine, they turned to something deceptively simple: bottles filled with hot water, layered with precision, used like living embers between cloth and bone. This wasn't convenience, it was calculation. Without firewood, coal, or power, every unit of heat had to matter. People didn't try to warm the air, they warmed themselves and carried the heat with them. The method began with metal or glass bottles, scavenged, reused, sometimes bartered. In some homes, thick-walled glass milk bottles were converted. In others, tin canisters or old thermos flasks served the purpose. These were not left to boil. They were filled with heated water, just below the boiling point, hot enough to radiate, not explode. Then came the layers. The bottles were wrapped in cloth, sheets, scarves, linen scraps, whatever could slow the release of heat without trapping moisture. Each bottle was then inserted into beds, inside jackets, beneath underlayers of clothing. But this wasn't random placement. Families had learned, over years of hardship, where heat mattered most. One bottle near the chest to protect vital organs, another at the feet to prevent frostbite, a third, if available, near the kidneys or lower back, where the body loses heat fastest. Some households built padded pouches stitched into sleeping sacks or worn like vests beneath coats. These pouches held the bottles close to the skin, but with insulation to avoid burns. In Estonia and Latvia, grandmothers taught children to sit with their feet in wooden buckets, heated water bottles tucked inside. Layers of straw were added above, trapping heat like a primitive spa. In other homes, cloth-wrapped bottles were placed beneath infants in hay-lined cradles, keeping them alive through the blackest nights. These bottles did more than warm. They dried wet socks. They thawed frozen hands. They gave sleep to bodies that shook from exhaustion. Unlike fire, they gave off no smoke. Unlike candles, they posed no flame risk. And unlike stoves, they required no structure, only the knowledge of when to heat and when to hold. But this method had its risks. Glass cracked if filled too fast. Metal leaked if corroded. Overheated water caused burns when insulation failed. Yet families learned. They timed their fires to boil once per day, at dusk. Then in silence, water was poured into bottles, wrapped, and distributed. It was ceremony. It was rationing, not of food, but of warmth. Some families went further. In Switzerland and northern France, where metal was more common, soldiers' canteens were repurposed as heat batteries. They were filled during the day, buried in wool or ash to retain heat, and pulled out only at nightfall. One family might pass a single canteen from person to person, like a torch through the darkest hours. In Poland, engineers turned this method into tools. They repurposed hollow bricks and clay tubes to hold heated water, laying them under thin straw mats. These poor man's radiant floors gave off just enough warmth to keep a child breathing through sub-zero nights. And everywhere, families gave the bottles to the weakest first, the elderly, the sick, the babies. Because in war, survival wasn't selfish. It was strategic and shared. This wasn't a gadget. This wasn't modern. This was ancient logic, reborn through broken glass and boiling water. Most of us have the pieces today: bottles, cloth, fire, but not the memory, not the urgency. They had both. And because of that, they stayed warm when warmth stopped arriving. They slept when the wind clawed through broken walls. They wrapped heat like treasure, quiet, flickering, and real. Could you survive the winter with nothing but bottles and boiling water? They did. And they didn't wait for rescue. They didn't have thermostats, they didn't have backup generators, space heaters, or double-glazed windows. And yet, they endured the kind of cold that shattered glass, cracked skin, and silenced entire villages. They survived not because they had heat, but because they knew how to hold on to warmth when the world around them offered none. From straw in broken walls to bricks beneath cold beds. From silent ash pits to bottles of boiling water passed hand to hand. They didn't chase comfort. They chased survival, one layer at a time. They didn't beg for fuel. They didn't wait for power lines to be restored. They built warmth from what little they had: stone, cloth, ash, and patience. This wasn't improvisation. It was inheritance, passed down from ancestors who'd survived darker winters, and passed forward, not to be clever, but to stay alive. Modern homes lose heat with the flick of a switch. These families lost cities, power, and peace. But they kept their fire even without flame. And now the question hangs in the air. If the grid vanished tonight, could we? Would we know how to line our walls without insulation? Would we know where the body loses heat fastest? Would we know how to keep a child warm? Without a single watt of electricity? They did. They learned through silence. They taught through repetition. And they survived not because they were lucky, but because they remembered what mattered. This knowledge is not lost, but it is disappearing unless we relearn it, unless we reclaim it, unless we prepare before we're forced to. Because when the cold comes, it won't knock and it won't wait. Hit subscribe to help revive these forgotten lifelines. One click brings back the memory of a generation that didn't freeze, because they prepared. And if they could survive the black winters of war with nothing but bricks and bottles, so can we.